Hi there. This is a new podcast called 20th Century Stories, and I am your host, Alex Murphy. In this podcast, I will be interviewing real life witnesses to some of the most interesting and relevant events of the 20th century, as well as giving my own opinion, talking about it from a historical perspective. Join me on this short journey as we discover some secrets and facts you may never have known about your favourite topics. This episode will be covering the first topic of this series, growing up in the UK, life in the 50s. Before we hear from our witness, our guest, I wanted to offer a short introduction, possibly a deeper dive for many into this topic. Post-war Britain, a country rebuilding itself from the rubble, yet still grappling with the trouble and the weight of austerity and uncertainty. The 1950s in the UK were not the romanticised era of jukeboxes and milk bars. For many, especially working class families, it was a decade marked by ration books, coal fires, and constant struggle. Streets were lined with soot-stained terraces. Children played in bombed out lots, remnants of a war that had ended but whose scars remained etched into daily life. Jobs were hard to come by, wages were low, and social mobility felt like a distant dream. Families often lived hand to mouth, relying on community spirit and sheer resilience to get by. The welfare state was still in its infancy, and while the NHS had just been born, access to opportunity was uneven and hard won. Yet amid the hardship, there was grit, there was humour, there was a kind of unspoken solidarity, neighbours helping neighbours and kids sharing scraps of bread and jam, parents doing whatever it took to keep the lights on and the children warm. This wasn't just a time of economic poverty, it was a time of emotional endurance. The UK was changing, slowly, maybe painfully for many, and not always fairly. But those who lived through it carry stories that deserve to be heard, not just for what they endured, but for what they overcame. Our witness today lived through the 50s as a child and teenager, living in an impoverished yet resilient household. Resilience being one of the key themes in the 50s, his experience deserves to be told.
So I was born in 1948 to a very Catholic family, 6 kids, so we were hard up quite a lot. We didn't have many toys or games or much money, so sometimes we would go on holiday and that would be a big thing for us. So first holiday I remember, we went to a caravan in Somerset, not far from where we lived in Bristol, and we had to go by train because nobody had cars in the 1950s, and it was a steam train, which now you see in museums. But we caught the steam train, and they had a system where old-fashioned trains had to pass like a token, like a big metal ring between stations, so that it was safety between stations. And as we're going along, the driver had it in his cab, and it fell out of the cab down the embankment into a field. So he couldn't carry on. So the train stopped, and then the driver came along and he said, "I can't find it. Can everybody get out of the train and help?" So all of us kids going on our holidays climbed out of the train in the middle of nowhere, down the embankment into the field to search for this. And eventually we found it and went on to our caravan, which was a pretty horrible caravan in a muddy beach under a sea wall, and we were all squashed in like sardines. But that was my first idea of a holiday. Otherwise, we would go and see my auntie in Horsham in Sussex and swap homes. Another thing I was going to talk about was Christmases. So again, we weren't that well off. So Christmases in the 1950s, with all us children wanting toys, we didn't really get much like people do nowadays. And it was always a board game. and always maybe something clockwork like a train set. But my dad liked playing with them, so you'd get a train set with a battery, and when you picked it up on Christmas morning, the battery would be flat because my dad had been playing with it the night before. So, and we couldn't get batteries, so we often had to play a board game. And in winter, that was all we did really, because we didn't have a television, so we would all sit around the fire and play board games. Nobody had central heating, so you're all squashed in. Now people dress down for comfort, like we do on aeroplanes, but in those days people dressed up. So your parents would probably buy you a special outfit for visiting elderly aunties and having Christmas dinner at home and stuff. So you'd actually dress up, yeah. Yeah. Everybody in the street knew each other. You all played with each other as mates because you didn't have a lot of money. So your games would be ball games, climbing trees. My favourite was building dams across streams. I used to spend my whole holidays building dams in streams. But yeah, all the kids would know each other, all the parents would know each other. You'd have street parties. The streets were empty, so you could play in the streets. So when you think back, almost nobody had a car. So the only vehicles you'd see would be like mobile shops or coal men delivering coal or something like that, milkmen. In the 50s, yeah, you would do things that were free. So you'd have somebody would have a football or a cricket bat and ball, and you'd go and play in the local field. Didn't necessarily have to be a park even, but yeah, you'd play games and you'd disappear all day with your mates. I mentioned that I used to love damming streams, so I would vanish with my friend after breakfast, and I would be gone all day for about 8 hours, standing in the bottom of a filthy muddy brook, building a dam across it, and I wouldn't be aware of what time it was, and nobody would know where I was. And eventually my brother would come and cycle down and tell me tea was ready. It was like 5 o'clock. So nobody really seemed to worry about safety and kids being watched in those days, which was maybe a good thing and a bad thing. Rock and roll in the 50s, it had its own uniform as well. So you've maybe heard of Teddy Boys. They dressed in certain ways, drainpipe trousers and skinny ties and greasy hair. I used to have greasy hair, and then all of a sudden I didn't have greasy hair because it was out of fashion when the Beatles arrived. The Beatles arrived in 1962. I had a sister who used to stand outside the theatre in Bristol, the stage door, waiting for stars to come out. 1962, the Beatles were not the top of the billing because they weren't famous yet, and they came out to go for a cup of tea in a cafe round the corner because nobody had heard of them, and she met them, 3 out of the 4 Beatles, and went to the cafe and chatted to them, all but George Harrison. And she has her school exercise book still with 3 signatures of 3 Beatles in, and it's been valued at thousands. The other thing I wanted to mention was my mum, certainly, and I think most mothers, unless they were very rich, mothers in those days had a really hard life. Most of them had big families. 6 kids was nothing unusual. We had 6. And they didn't have any washing machines. In my mum's kitchen, I always remember a big round boiler, which she just put the clothes in and sort of poked them with a stick as the boiling water just boiled away. Then she would have to put them through a thing called a mangle. Have you ever heard the word mangle? It's like this thing where you turn a handle and the clothes go through these 2 rollers to squeeze the water out. Then she would have to hang them on the line. Then she would have to iron them with an iron that wasn't like modern steam irons. It took forever. Clothes, you're getting kids ready. She was cooking on an ancient little stove. Everything took longer and was much harder. Nappies, you didn't have throwaway nappies for babies. It was all ones you had to wash. So mothers had a really, really hard life.
In the 50s, if you to think about the 50s, what single word would you say could sum it up for you? I mean, you could choose any word, a description word, some kind of anything. If you were to think about the 50s in one word, what would
Me personally or my family?
you personally, what
Me
would you say
personally.
it looks like?
Because I was a child, fun. The word I would use if I'd been my parent in the 50s would be exhausting. They were probably shattered every day. Stuff I haven't mentioned, like coal fires. You'd have to make a fire every day and get it going, and then clean it all out and start it again the next morning because there was no other form of heating. So huge amounts of work parents had to do.
Was there a social kind of pressure or a social norm for people to get married or kind of even have children if they were married? Was there some kind of pressure, or did everyone want to have children, or was it, or what would you say? Because it seems like to me becoming a parent was kind of putting yourself through, yeah, like you say, a very exhausting. You were kind of preparing yourself for a very exhausting period.
The pressure was from elderly aunties. Oh, why haven't you had any? Aren't you pregnant yet? There was pressure to get married young. So you would get married when you were 20, where now you either don't or you're in your 30s. There would be pressure to have lots of kids. You didn't really have a choice as parents. Although maybe parents wanted lots of kids because that was the norm. So, yeah, there were very few people that didn't have kids. And they were thought of as a problem almost, oh, what's the problem? Why can't you have kids? It's not, I don't want any. You must have a medical problem kind of thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. What we've just heard is a powerful glimpse into life in 1950s Britain, a time when music offered maybe escape and connection. Hardship shaped resilience, and social norms defined daily struggle. Yet through it all, communities stood strong. Neighbours leaned on each other, families found joy in the little things, and voices, like the one we've just heard, carried stories that still echo today. This marks the end of today's podcast. However, tune back in for the next topic, fashion and pop in the 60s in Britain, somewhat developing on the story we've heard today. If you enjoy listening to podcasts, please also check out my channel on Spotify or Amazon Prime Music under the same name of 20th Century Stories. I plan to release my content on these platforms before moving on to YouTube, so if you want to listen to the next story but just can't wait, make sure to pop over and have a look. Thank you.